I'm Jane Vossler, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center and the Richmond Historical Society. We're co-sponsoring this. So it's great to have Dona with us today. She's a professor emerita at UVM. She taught history there for almost 30 years. And she's written a book on this topic, but also on a few others. And she just told me she's not starting a new book yet because this one took a lot of work. So I'll turn it over to you, Dona.
Thank you, Jane. I should have said I was working on something new. This is my great opportunity to advertise, but no, not yet. So I've been thinking about talking here and just been thinking about how often when I talk to groups like this one, everybody in the audience knows more about the subject that I'm about to talk about than I do, so that's not going to surprise me. I will ask you for your information about that too. So I called this Farming in Richmond, Bolton, and Huntington 100 years ago, the best of times, the worst of times. I think that I call it that because I have always thought that we have a really strong tendency to think that of things in the past as being simple and stable and unchanging. And in the time period I want to look at today, that's not really the case, and particularly not in rural life, where we really have a strong desire, I think, and tendency to think of it as being kind of bucolic and beautiful like this. And in many ways it was, but in Vermont, this time period of the early 20th century was a time of wrenching change in agriculture. And that's true in your towns as well as in some of the other towns I've worked on across the state. So I wanted to just give you a sense of the framework for that. We can see that back in the 1920s, farming was the default way of life for pretty much everybody outside of the major cities in Vermont. That was true in Richmond and Huntington and Bolton, just as it was almost everywhere else in Vermont. And in fact, in most parts of the country, the standard way of life was farming. A little closer look, though, complicates things, even in our area, in the area we're talking about. And of course, you know that these three towns were not simply farming towns. Of course, there were no longer just farming towns, and they hadn't been for a long time. The railroads built up the Winooski River way back in the 1840s. And from then on, that transportation system supported the development of lumber mills and factories and all kinds of commercial activity, especially in downtown Richmond. And the three towns were still dominated by farming in 1930, but the type of farming was also changing over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So, for example, the 1930 federal census reported that there were 73 families in the town of Bolton, and 41 of them were living on farms, were farming. So over half of the towns in Bolton, the households in the town of Bolton were farmers. Huntington, also around 55%. Richmond's a little more complicated because of its vast commercial development in the early 20th century. The town outside the village counted 79 farm households out of a total. So 2/3 of the households in Richmond outside of the village were also farmers. Still, the three towns were showing an important difference in their developmental trajectory. Richmond's number of farms had remained stable over the previous whole generation. So I'm saying the early part of the 20th century. Declining a little bit, but basically stable. Huntington's number of farms also remained comparatively stable over that period from 1900 to 1930, a little loss. But in that same period, Bolton lost almost half of its farms. So there had been 74 farms in 1900, there were 41 in 1930. So that was going on, that kind of difference, that kind of change was going on in the rest of the state as well. Okay, and what's happening in these three towns is really typical of what's happening across Vermont. So let me step back from this a little bit. Back in the early days of settlement, farming practices had been very much the same everywhere in Vermont, right? And everywhere. It didn't matter whether it was a little or a big farm or a mountain farm or a valley farm or in the northern or southern part of the state. It was pretty much the same kind of farm operation in the original settlement. Most Vermont farmers and most New England farmers, in fact, during those early years, would have been so familiar with how everybody else farmed that they could probably have stepped into the same roles on other farms in other parts of the state and even the region and done the same job there. Of course, there are regional variations, but the overall framework was the same. And if you look at it, you will not be surprised by anything I say. Up until the early 20th century, most Vermont farms practiced something they used to refer to as mixed farming. And by mixed farming, they mean they grew a lot of different kinds of crops. They raised both animals and plants, as in this slide showing here a whole bunch of different animals in this dooryard kind of hanging out together. Very typical of that early period. And mixed also means that they practiced both commercial farming and subsistence farming, right? And by that I simply mean that they produce for their own consumption and also for local or regional markets. They usually have one or two commercial products that worked for them that they counted on for the cash they needed. And that was the norm. The expectation was that everybody provided for themselves as much as was possible and practical, right? And then on the side or as an extra or as you had time, you would invest in a cash crop. And that was kind of the common sense fallback position for farming. It almost goes without saying that all farmers would, of course, produce what they needed, their own meat, their own milk, their own eggs, their own apples and maple and potatoes, and when you start to think about it, and their own hay and corn and rye and oats needed for their cattle and pigs and chickens and horses and sheep. It gets complicated when you start to think about it. But that is the norm. Almost nobody farmed only for their own use in Vermont. Almost everybody sold something on the markets. These are not subsistence farms. For example, they weren't usually raising their own wheat for the table anymore, and they bought flour, along with stuff that they really couldn't grow for themselves, like rum and tobacco. And later, they bought industrially produced things, cloth and shoes and soap and stuff like that. And they did have commercial crops they brought to market, usually cream. That's about 1860s there. That farmer is probably taking his cans of cream to a creamery to be made into butter. But the consensus advice by the experts was that the house should provide first for itself and secondarily the surplus. Commercial crops were important, maybe essential to the prosperity of these farms, but they could come and go without endangering the family's security, right? Most farmers invested only in small ways in commercial crops, and usually with an eye to resilience and flexibility, like not too much on any one product. There are some exceptions to that you know about, probably the sheep craze of the 1830s and 40s. It was like this big phenomenon in Vermont where everybody got involved in raising sheep for wool. But even then, most people didn't like go whole hog, so to speak, into raising sheep. They really would raise 5 or 10 and shear them for wool and put them into the market, see how it goes. Maybe next year they do more, maybe less. Even during the biggest boom, most Vermont farmers just dip a toe into big commercial ventures. And by the middle of the late 19th century, the most common practice on Vermont farms was to produce a mixture of wool and butter and maple as cash crops, depending on who you were and where you were. But those were the 3 most reliable cash crops. Then in the late 19th century, some places start to change. Some farms in some parts of Vermont begin to move in a different direction. They start to concentrate more and more on dairy products for increasingly distant markets, like sometimes as far as Boston. But starting in the mid-19th century, Vermont farmers begin to produce, first of all, more and more butter, like this guy here, either at home or by sending their cream to a local creamery. There were 2 by the early 20th century in Richmond, for example. And that change ultimately had a bigger impact on how those farmers operated than anything up until then. Concentrating on dairy products gradually brought Vermont farmers into a whole new set of practices and even social arrangements. So, for example, there's a shift in livestock raising to producing purebred cows of specific breeds. So in the early days, most New England farmers had these cows that are Devon red. They're just called them red cows in people's wills and probates and stuff. It'll just say 4 red cows. That's the cows they brought with them from England to Massachusetts. They've been around for a long time. They're adapted to both meat and milk production. They're very hardy, and they're not carefully bred. They're just kind of rough and tough. But what happens as some farmers start to go more into commercial production first of cream is they start to develop an interest in new kinds of cattle, like these. These are Jerseys, in Jersey, where they come from. Jerseys are, if you know these beautiful little pale cows, with the big long eyelashes and the big eyes, they produce not a lot of milk, but a lot of cream, a lot of fat in that milk. And so it's not a huge production, but it's like what you get is really what these farmers were looking for. And they're a little bit more fragile, and they need to be fed better, and they need to have better housing, and they're pricier. So some farmers start to move in that direction of upgrading their cattle herds and then doing what's necessary to keep those cattle safe, like building better barns and maybe purchasing some extra good grain for them during times when their own feed wasn't good enough and stuff like that. So most farmers, some farmers began to replace that old style mixed system and moving toward more a single crop, first with these little Jerseys and Guernsey cattle. Bigger herds also come into play, and you start to see, and then as a third step, which I'll talk about in a bit, by the early 20th century, they're really hip, very modernizing Vermont farmers are moving away from Jerseys and Guernseys and toward the cows that have become the cows that represent Vermont, right? Holsteins, high production, lots of milk, not such good cream, right? But at that point, they were turning toward what was called at the time fluid milk for sale. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. But that change of kinds of cows could almost mark the changes in the countryside. You start to see bigger herds. You start to see breeds that need all kinds of off-farm inputs, pulling farmers toward buying more off-farm feed and even off-farm fertilizers eventually, gradually. And especially once they shift toward fluid milk production in the early 20th century, you can see that if you're moving from the late 19th century, most Vermont farmers were producing cream for butter or maybe possibly sending cream directly to a consumer market. That's a little different from selling straight up fresh milk in those cans, right? There has to be straight to consumers. There has to be more quality control. There's less buffer about cleanliness and how long it's been sitting around and stuff like that. So that requires more investment and more timeline, and you got to get a car by the 20s and drive it to the town and all kinds of things like that, right? So there's a big shift going on, and that big shift is happening especially in some places. So if you look at this image, for example, I mean, this is Woody Jackson painted, not that long ago, but he has it all set up exactly what the infrastructure cost was for someone who was really modernizing their dairy operation in the early 20th century. So the correct cows, the high production cows. By the way, Holsteins are way bigger than other cows, and so they eat more. And so they are more trouble in a lot of ways. But the silos, although these are late 20th century silos started to come in here for feeding high quality feed to high-end animals like this. Bigger barns. I was thinking as I was driving over here, almost all the big remaining barns that we see around here, between here and Underhill, where I live, all those giant barns are early 20th century or turn of the century in origin, or even later. Those are the signs of a high input, modernizing dairy operation. Okay. It means changes that lead to adaptation of new technologies, of milking machines, for example. Here, this is from the 1930s. This is a Great Depression era photograph of a little boy in, I think someplace in Franklin County, milking with a milking machine, right? New technologies, milking machines, silos, electricity in the barn to chill the milk, right? Refrigeration and electricity and lights, a shift to year-round milking. Most farmers, up till the early 20th century and even beyond, milked their cows only in the summer and fall, because that's when that's how they bred them. They bred them to have their calves in the spring, and then they'd have a production until the cow dried off, and then they let them rest for the winter, and they let themselves rest for the winter. That's not really good if what you're looking for is a ton more income and a ton more involvement in the market. And so some farmers start to invest in what it takes to do year-round farming, which is mainly more labor, if you can get it, right? And even you can see farming investment in automobiles and in other people in milk trucks and paved roads and all those kinds of things as part of that process of modernizing dairy and making Vermont farmers part of a modern industrializing infrastructure. This is a similar photograph from the 1930s from the Farm Security Administration photographs, which are an incredible treasure trove of beautiful photographs from the time. And you can see the guy driving his milk cans, probably to the train station. It doesn't just mean more technology, it means more bank loans, and it means more, need to think about constant income and how you're going to pay the farmhands and so forth, right? So eventually, all of this is coming across Vermont, but it doesn't hit everywhere evenly. And that's kind of my main story for today about Vermont farming 100 years ago, is that this model of modernizing doesn't happen everywhere. Some places it never happens. Some places it's very common, and it depends on a lot of things. In 1930s, in many ways, these changes had not gone very far yet. So for example, when I say bigger cattle herds, the average cattle herd size in Vermont in 1930 was 10. Right? And that's including all those really big players who had 20. So it's big for them, and it's a huge investment, but it's not what we're accustomed to thinking as big. And if we were to look at them, we would certainly still see these modernizing farms as quaint and old-fashioned, right? They would still look old to us. And in fact, almost all these farmers still provided most of their own needs for themselves. They didn't just stop doing all the rest of their farming when they took up commercial dairy farming, but it pushed them away toward that balance that had been there before, toward the commercial crop, and away from more self-sufficiency and more resilience on their own farms. And a lot of them still hedge their bets with sidelines in addition to the production of dairy, most often maple, but also lumber, pigs. Pigs could work really well with cattle, because if you just want the cream, you feed the skim to the pigs, it all works. And more important, this path toward modernization, is not only not taken by all Vermont farmers. There are people who don't choose to go that way, right? More and more kinds of Vermont farmers and their practices and experiences were growing increasingly far apart in the 1920s. So you can really see a big change happening. This is a map I'll show you, which is going to be too hard for you to see, so I'm going to explain it. So this is, in the 1930 census, they categorized types of farms in Vermont as being dairy, general, or self-sufficing, okay? The red is dairy. So if you look at Chittenden County, 67% of its farmers were dairy farmers. 5% were classified as general farmers, and 6% as self-sufficing. But if you look down here at Windham, 34% of its farms were dairy farms, and 20% were general. In other words, it's ranged across the state. The most modernizing, most dairy-oriented of farmers in 1930 were above here, so in the Northwest. And the least modernizing were in the Southeast and the Southwest, too. So that shows you, I think, a little bit about the ways that region partly determined who was going to do what. It has to do with things that you would expect, like railroad connections, like Richmond, but more than that, right? A clear pattern is geographical. And if you look at our three towns, it's a rather complicated picture. They're in Chittenden County, kind of. Some of them are only barely in Chittenden County. But their numbers are not as high in dairy as the county in general. In Bolton, all but 3 of its 41 farms in 1930 were listed as dairy farms. So Bolton had all dairy farms, supposedly. But in Huntington, all but 4 of the 90 farms were listed not as dairy farms, but as general farms. And in Richmond town, all but 1 farm is also listed as general. So first of all, I think if I had to bet on it, I think part of those really striking differences have to do with the census taker. I'm betting that the census taker in Bolton had a very generous definition of the term dairy farm, and the one in Huntington was more skeptical about the whole thing. So I can't say for sure what it really means, but here's where my research on another town might come in handy. So the basic work I've done for this book, Hill Farms, comes from the town of Jamaica down in southeastern Vermont in Windham County. A little bit rougher even than the roughest landscape around here, right? This is the mountains. It's one town away from the big ski resorts down there, right? So it's rough, it's rugged, it's a lot of rocks, and it's very steep. In that little mountain town, high up in the southern Green Mountains, almost the exact opposite of our part of Vermont in some ways. This photograph is taken from a town nearby. It's on the cover of my book, 1930 something, in the town of Athens in southeastern Vermont. And if you look and see what they're doing, they are cutting hay on this hillside with scythes. So in the other photographs that went with this, they actually had a horse-drawn hay cutting operation, but they didn't use it up here because it's too steep. So they're still walking across their steep fields and cutting them with scythes. The guy from the federal government was super impressed with this, and he took like 9,000 pictures of these guys. I think he must have made them go back and walk back and forth like 20 times to get these beautiful things. But it isn't just, one thing is clear from these images. Farms in valleys and floodplains were modernizing and becoming commercial operations. Farms in hillsides, not so much. And that was true in the Connecticut River Valley and the really giant valleys, but also along the White River Valley and the Lamoille and the Winooski and the smaller tributary rivers like Browns River. A better location, a flatter floodplain location, is likely to encourage you to commercialize, to develop more modern ways of doing business. And similarly, farms located in towns with good railroad connections and later good roads, which is, of course, the entire story of this area, right, are more likely to modernize. And all three of our towns have, in varying degrees, most of what it took to become modern farms. The railroad and all the accompanying modern infrastructure in Richmond Village, where you can buy grain for cattle, sell your milk to a creamery in Richmond Village, like that one. Nope, that's a different farm. This one, like that creamery. Or to the condensed milk factory, or get your farm equipment fixed. There's all this kind of infrastructure that's developing to serve these modernizing farms. So this I put in as an example of a nice picture of a 1920s modernizing farm in Richmond. Hard to see from where you are, but there's a really large herd of black and white cows, really large barn with silos attached to it. And it says underneath on this that they take tourists. A dead giveaway that they're modern. So this change becomes so clear that in the early 20th century, the old-fashioned farms, the ones who are still doing what they have always been doing, start to stand out. They start to look different to the experts in the state, the agricultural advisors, the state officials. They start to see things increasingly different in the early 20th century. And these old-fashioned farms, now starting to be called hill farms, look more and more like they're the ones who are doing something problematic, right? Lots of people are beginning to think that it was crazy to keep farming in places like those. And there's a rising sense, especially among agricultural experts and political leaders, that the old ways of farming are endangering the state's economic future. This was the 20s. Vermont was talking all the time about how far behind they were and how they were losing people and how their economy was stagnant. And the hill farms look increasingly like it's their fault. Right? The population statistics explain this. Here we see the different population cycles in different towns in comparison with our three. So the pink, the yellow, and the red are the three towns here. Yellow is Richmond, Bolton is red, Huntington is pink, and then the blue one at the top, which is the big winner here, is bustling Essex, where the population is growing like crazy. And this is just not in the village, this is in the town. And then the other one I put in is the green one is my little town of Jamaica down in the south, and you can see, boy, they started losing people back in the 1830s, and they never stopped, right? And that's a little bit like what happens with Bolton. Bolton isn't quite that extreme, but it's similar. And then you see Richmond here actually growing in population over time. So from the standpoint of the people who are in charge of state development policy and so forth, the towns like Bolton and Huntington start to look like the problem, and especially some of the farms in places like Bolton and Huntington, and especially the farms in places like Jamaica. The population statistics really show a lot of why people were worried. Most towns in Vermont started off more or less the same way. This early growth from settlement is typical, up almost all the same until a certain point, and I won't go into why. But these hill towns, and especially the very steep hill towns, or the ones that are more isolated, are losing people very fast. And all that population decline and loss of farms led to a lot of worry. They're too steep to use modern farm equipment, as you saw from my picture of the scythes. And a lot of the leaders in the 20s became convinced that the only way to save Vermont farming in the face of the increasing competition from the West that they were worried about was to modernize, or if you couldn't, then to get out. Right? And so state policy in the 1920s was to encourage people to get big or get out. Not like in the 1980s, because big was not the same, but still the same principle, right? A rising generation of farm experts associated with the Agricultural College and the experiment station at UVM are convinced that a more scientific and business-like approach to farming has to be done everywhere. More attention to profit, more bookkeeping, more long-term investments, more technology updates, all that stuff. Small old-fashioned farms, hill farms, needed to get bigger. They needed to get more involved with commercial crops, get better roads in town. They needed to invest in new technologies. They needed to think differently about what farming was about. They needed to think more about the bottom line, right? If they couldn't, or if they didn't want to, they should probably get out, leave their town and go somewhere else. And because of that, places like Jamaica, and to some extent Bolton, become the focus of some of those expert worries. And they're the subjects, this is where I'm coming to the work that I've done. They're the subjects of a variety of in-depth studies generated mostly by UVM. These new types of soil surveys come in. So again, I know this is hard to see, but you can see that this is a very, very detailed, though not as detailed as they did get in the 1930s, depiction of soil groups and where are the places that you probably shouldn't be bothering to farm. And this comes from a 1929 in-depth study of 13 hill towns and their land use. And these 13 hill towns are marked in black here. If you want to see a close-up, there's closer to our, here's our towns. Is this Fayston? Okay. Fayston was one of the 13 towns that got studied. So the studies, incredibly detailed studies of land use and of farming practices and so forth. And they found big problems in the hills. Population loss, of course, reforestation, the woods were growing back, and poverty, as you could easily imagine. And in this map, you can see that the researchers judged the Vermont towns in red to be as problematic as the 13 towns they studied. These are places they thought should probably be taken out of farming and put back into trees. And you can see that that includes 2 of the 3 towns we're talking about, right? Not Richmond, but the other 2 in red means, the red means that they are similar in topography, similar in their land use, and similar in their population loss to the 13 towns that they studied. And these black ones, they're easy to see in the previous slide. This is a really cool study, amazing drawing, all these hand-drawn things. You can see they go right along the spine of the Green Mountains, and the places that are not marked, like the entire Champlain Valley, that's because they're not a problem. Okay, so one mark, if you look at these things, it's clear that there are going to be winners and losers in the modernization process. There are marginal hill farms, for example, in the town of Essex, but the things that Essex had, the broad rivers, the rich river soils, the broad valleys, the good transportation connections, lots of commercial development. These are all things that made farming modernizing easier. And one mark of Essex's relative success was the stability of its number of farms. So for example, I looked at Underhill, the town I live in, went from lost a quarter of its farms in the early 20th century. Jamaica lost over 40% of its farms. Essex, just 12%. So they are resilient, they're bouncing back, and they're very, very successful. And you can see the same thing happening in a smaller way in the 3 towns here. So hill farms that tried to retain the old mixed ways of farming are experiencing hardships. But I wanted to emphasize that the path to modernization for farmers was also not without its problems and risks. And not always a better bet than hanging on to the old days. For example, here's what, this is just I just put it in here as a random page from one of many studies of dairy farms in Vermont in the early 20th century. Here's an example. Every year beginning in the 1920s, the Agricultural Experiment Station published one of a series of studies of dairy farms, attempting to work out best practices, right? To tell them how many cows they should have and how they should handle them and what feed they should have and so forth. Now, you have to know that the ag experiment folks are all in on dairy. They believe that fluid milk production is the best bet for Vermont farmers and will take Vermont farming safely into the 20th, presumably 21st century. To the experts, that path forward seemed clear, but their own studies, if you look at them carefully, suggest that the path they advocated was not as simple as they thought it was. It was a very difficult road to take, even in the best regions for dairy farming. For example, one study on Randolph and Royalton advised farmers to invest in higher quality cows. But another study, and this one was on Cabot and Marshfield, concluded that higher priced cows would produce more milk only if they were fed more purchased grain. So first you have to spend more on the cows, then you have to spend more on the grain, and then, for example, again, a 1926 study concluded that you needed around 24 cows. That would be the best economy of scale. But another study warned that that size of herd would probably also require the farmer to buy a milking machine and hire a year-round worker. And as a result, the farmer would then have to find an efficient year-round job for that worker, which would probably lead him to milking in winter when the prices were higher. Of course, it also means that he has to have a reliable source of year-round labor, which he doesn't have because all of his neighbors' kids have gone somewhere else. So what they end up doing is not actually hiring extra labor, but just putting more work into the family, right? So it just actually really, even in the areas that were able to meet these new standards, that success comes at a cost. So one study of dairy farmers in Enosburg, this is my favorite. Enosburg was actually a pretty successful dairy farming area. And the study revealed that the average dairy herd size was 22. That ought to have required a full-time hired worker. But they couldn't afford, and they probably couldn't find workers to sustain that number of cows. So they exchanged work with one another, and mostly they made do with extra unpaid work from the members of their own households, added to the farm households' already quite heavy workloads. The UVM home economist Marian Muse found, for example, that on farms like these, Vermont farm women average summer work days of 12 and a half hours, and their husbands 13 and a half hours. I'm sure they're not counting childcare in the 12 and a half hours, right? But nevertheless, those are long days. And even working that hard would not guarantee reliable profits. Long before the Great Depression hit, prices for milk had been profoundly unstable. A few years of high prices during World War I had really encouraged everybody to get moving in this direction, but they were followed by persistent losses in prices in the 20s. In the very first of these studies in 1925, the researcher wrote that the most striking thing about the figures he had calculated for his farmers was, quote, the meagerness of the financial return secured by the farmers of this region. It's like, that's shocking to you, is it? That was Randolph and Royalton, and those were very highly successful dairy farms with a lot of significant advantages. The researcher blamed the problem on a temporary downturn, and it is true that prices for milk went back up for a few years, but that was like in 1927. So in 1929, prices for milk had already been going down before the stock market crash. And then once the whole economy went belly up, prices for milk were less than half, and sometimes a third of what they had been before the crash. Even in one single month, they dropped by a quarter. And so they dropped by 1930 or 31, well below the farmer's break-even point. So at that point, from then on till most of the 30s, most dairy farmers were operating at a straight-up loss. In those years, the dairy experts at the Ag Experiment Station were a little flummoxed. They reported that the more a farm was investing in dairy, the worse it was hit by the Depression. The bigger the farm, the greater the loss. They didn't want to admit it, but they were honest researchers, and so they did. And they reported, for example, that in the dire winter of 1931, quote, the average farmer in each district lacked roughly $400 of receiving any pay whatsoever to his year's work. So he's underwater by $400, which was a year's salary then for some people. If it had not been for the, quote, living he had from the farm, that is the house, the woods, the garden, the cows and chickens, the no rent he's paying, and so forth, the household would have had literally less than nothing to live on. As the researcher put it, that year, quote, the advantage of diversification was greater than usual, which I thought, that's a faint way of putting it. And for a few years, at least, some agricultural experts actively encouraged farmers to return to relying on more old-fashioned mixed farming practices. Especially Federal New Deal agency experts encouraged farmers to diversify and produce for themselves. If you want to be amused and horrified, you could look at these detailed accounts of what New Deal experts were telling people to do, because they were utterly inconsistent and flat out contradictory with each other within like the space of weeks or days. So they would tell farmers to do something completely at odds with each other. But they were specifically telling them, good to be self-sufficient, good to grow your own chickens like this family, good to cut your own wood. You can see the big trees over there in the corner. You can sell some of that lumber. You can probably sell eggs if any of your neighbors can afford them. Of course, the Depression hit all rural people hard, not just big commercial dairy farmers. Even farmers who relied much less on the commercial market hit hard times. Small hill farmers generally marketed their surplus to their neighbors in town, but in many cases those neighbors could no longer afford to buy your surplus potatoes or your eggs or your firewood, or to hire you to do a little extra work. All of those things dried up for people. But there is one piece of evidence I found that those who had not stepped onto the modernizing path may have been better off, at least for a little while. And this is one more chart. This image is from 1935. And it shows the density of relief, the percentage of people who are on relief, which just means taking any kind of help from the government in any form. And the percentage, this is 1935, so this is probably the depth of the time period. So the black towns, it's 15% and over of the population of the town is relying on government assistance. And then it goes from there to the less bad ones are these dark checkered ones, and then the light ones are just less and less and less, until you can see some clear white ones that there's no one in town who's taking government aid. Now, we could talk about why that might be. I mean, maybe there's more shame in those places. Maybe they relied on each other more. I don't know. But it's clear. So if you look at it that way, where's the worst? That's Barrie. Industrial centers where people are out of work. That's where places are really. Barrie, Rutland, this is Burlington, St. Albans. The white places with no people on relief are the most backward farming regions in the state. Those are the places where they're not asking for help. Down here and up there in the Northeast Kingdom. And if you look at the close-up of our area, you can see a similar thing. Richmond relief cases, somewhere between 5 to 10% of Richmond's population is on relief. Bolton, somewhere between 2.5% and 5%. Huntington, less than 2.5%. Right? So the most backward farming part of these three towns is the one that has the least need, or at least is taking the least aid from the government. That seems to me to be a pretty impressive piece of information, even if there are all kinds of caveats about how to interpret it. But if you look at the catastrophic situation of people in Burlington and Barrie and Rutland and Bennington, and then you look at poverty-stricken Jamaica and Bolton, it's really an interesting testimony about how much relying on older methods of farming might get you by hard times. Looking at it that way, it's not hard to understand why even a very well-informed early 20th century Vermont farmer might decide not to modernize. If we can imagine, here's a nice farm in I think it's Jamaica. I mean, in what's the name of this town? Richmond. This isn't. You have to look at this close up. I can't really get you to see it well. But this little farm right here, plain little house, that looks like a potato field around it. Barn over here, unpainted, smaller than the big modern ones. There's a few cows out here, not many. The fields are cleared, right? There's a little road going through here. So this is, I think, a good example of a farm that has not done very much to modernize. Why you might not move toward modernization. Imagine that this guy who owns this farm was unusually lucky. His land was pretty good by Vermont standards. It looks okay. And he has enough that he could adapt it to modern dairy farming. Maybe his barn was big enough now and he could make a bigger one. Maybe he had enough acreage to support the 22 cows he should have. And it's located on a pretty good road. There's an electric line there. So there's all kinds of opportunities. Maybe they even had access to a little financial aid. Maybe he had an uncle who worked in the bank or something. But even with all these advantages, scaling up the farm would come at a significant cost. It would require extra hours of work from already very heavily burdened family workers. If the farmer was able to market milk in the winter market, that would extend their work year round, right? It would tie the farm operation to purchases that they would have to pay for in cash and commit it to the use of outside labor that would be hard to find and expensive to pay for. And it would make the entire household dependent on what surely must have seemed to have been the wildly unstable milk market of that time period. So this farm household might decide to keep to the old ways, or at least hedge their bets. And then finally, if we look back from our viewpoint today, the modernizing path has come to seem even more problematic, at least to me. In a sense, we know the end of this story after all. We know those barns all fell down. We know that those businesses are all out of business now. After the Great Depression, the push to modernize returned with full strength. And in the 1950s, that push was sustained by a baby boom, which drank a lot of milk, right? But from then on, each wave of business and technological change led to more get big or get out pressure. And each census counted fewer farms. The story of Vermont farming after World War II was in one way a success story, right? More farms looked like that. But in another way, it's a story of slow and then very rapid decline. In the end, the big new commercial farms went the same way as the small, scruffy hill farms, mostly. And Richmond, Bolton, and Huntington, like the rest of Vermont, have seen the loss of nearly all their farms. Commercial dairying did not, in the end, and probably could not, save farming in Vermont. But ironically, it did have sadly, in a funny way, it did have a continued impact on the state in the mid and late 20th century. While they're gradually going out of business, Vermont's most modern dairy farms came to look old-fashioned and timeless, especially to visitors. So places that looked like this Woody Jackson piece of work looked to people who are visiting from out of state like some kind of timeless and beautiful farm economy that's never changed since like 1750 or something. And the very signs of their modernity, the silos, the big barns, the black and white cows, the prosperous valleys, these also become long-lasting images of the real old-fashioned Vermont. Right? And that's why you can go downtown on Church Street and buy images like this by Woody Jackson for a great deal of money, or just mugs, right? Now, of course, these farms are all but gone, along with all the others. But the only places they may survive in the end are on the pages of calendars. Thank you. If anybody has any questions.
Yeah, if you have questions, I'll bring you the mic. I'll bring you the mic.
I have a comment rather than a question. When I drive around Vermont or even my home part of this world, I see the silos and see them as tombstones.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is so sad.
Yeah. I mean, I could use what you've said to end the talk. It made me think really hard about when I first started working on these farms in Jamaica, which, you know, I know that makes no sense to farm on those hillsides in those rocks and in that climate and, you know, with those rivers that rush through and break everything every week. But you know what? Those people lived fine, and they hung on and they kept their land until they just couldn't do it anymore. I mean, the pressure just got too great. And I don't think people hold on to old ways of doing things if there's not a good reason for it. And now, alas, we have the wisdom of hindsight that those small, scruffy, not very profitable farms might have been just maybe this is what we'll have now. Sometimes I think maybe this is what we're getting now, is in young people now making small, unprofitable, scruffy, barely getting by farms. Those are the future, I hope, anyway. Yeah.
How many of the farms went out of business due to the 27 flood?
You know, that's interesting. How many farms went out of business because of the 1927 flood, which is right in this time period? The flood hit some places really hard, more often infrastructure, railroads and roads, and especially like in Jamaica, up in the mountains, that railroad that was the one commercial connection they had was out for a long time. In fact, it only got built again because the state went ahead and paid for it, which was unheard of at the time. But the floodplains themselves, the farms themselves, recovered pretty well from them. There were a few places where it took years. I think I read in a story in Waitsfield where there were very profitable dairy farms right along the edge of the water, and they were completely trashed. I mean, it was like more recent floods that we know. There was gravel over the good fields and that kind of thing. Some of those, I think, took a generation to recover. But they were going concerns, and so there wasn't, I think, much question that they would give it up. Yeah, so I don't know of any other places where there was like, okay, this town says we've had it, that's the last time they're gonna flood us out. But there were probably individual families who had that experience, depending on where they're. Do you have one in mind you're thinking of?
I just know that Tom O'Neill was stranded at the top of his house during the flood.
I guess that Tom O'Neill was stranded in the top of his house. Yeah, I imagine that might change your mind about your future in that place. Something like that, personal trauma. Yeah. Most of the people who died were in towns, though. That doesn't say much for the people who experienced it, of course, it doesn't really matter. But most of the places that lost most life were downtown Montpelier, downtown Winooski, those kinds of places. I'm back here first.
I would put my farm in the scruffy category. We are entering our 28th season just down the road on Route 2, Maple Wind Farm. And
You're from Maple Wind, wow.
Yeah.
I'm impressed. I don't think you count as scruffy.
Well, we've been scruffing by, let's say that. And I think that part of the reason why we're still pushing through is basically because of our community. We've had extreme floods 2 years in a row. We had a barn burn down. We just keep plugging away. And I think that the one problem that we face is that people have just, let's say over the years, just gone with convenience. They're just going into Williston. They're going to the one-stop shop stores. And I think just earlier today, someone stopped into my farm stand and she just said, I love the intimacy, I love the, and for some people, making multiple stops to get your groceries is not as convenient, but it's more personal, and you're gonna get something grown with love. And so I would encourage people to kind of, go away from the one-stop shop convenience and go to where they can really talk to the people that are are growing your food. And I think that's going to take us into the future and keep the smaller farms that are popping up in Huntington and Richmond. I can name 5 that I would love to see those young people continue their own farms into the future. So
Yeah, and one, thank you for that. That's really, I want to say thank you for your service. One thing that made me interested in thinking about these Jamaica farms to begin with was that I kind of saw them in some ways as role models, as people who were able to knew their land, who knew its limitations, who could work out a little something on the side that would fit the niche that they had available and who could go with it. And I thought that's a powerful role model. At the same time, though, I'm aware that people today who are doing the work that was similar to them, we have pressures on us that they didn't have, right? If their kids got through 8th grade at the local school, they could feel good about that. They didn't have to send them to college. They didn't have to find cash for that. They didn't need health insurance. There wasn't any health insurance, you know? It was like, I'm not saying that was some kind of wonderful existence. I'm only saying there wasn't any real pressure on them to acquire the things that are absolute cash necessities now for people who work on farms, that they just got by without one way or another. Yeah, so it is they can only be role models in a couple of basic ways, in knowing your land and knowing your limits and knowing what can be done. Tell her you're going to be next.
Can you describe, or do you know what the role of maple, how it's changed over time?
Oh, sure, yeah. So the question is how the role of maple has changed over time. So everybody in Vermont has always made maple with sugar until the late 19th century. I imagine that some people made some syrup and used it at home, but there was no market for maple syrup. There was only a market for maple sugar, and most farmers did tap, had a sugar bush of some kind, did tap for themselves or maybe just for local sales, and they preferred sugar. And they preferred sugar that was as white as they could get it. So the market was really different, right? They were trying to imitate granulated sugar. And then somewhere in the very late 19th century, a style shift occurs, partly as a result of urban interest in old-fashioned New England stuff. So there's a kind of a tourist-driven interest in old-fashioned rural Vermont and all of New England products, and that encourages a demand for maple syrup, which has sort of been there on the edges, but it was perceived as being more, it was the kind of thing people had as experiences when they came to visit and on pancakes or, that kind of thing. So that in the 1880s, usually the first time the census starts counting how much maple syrup is being made in Vermont. And it's called maple molasses. So they start counting it then, and by 1930, the sugar market was completely gone, and everybody was making syrup. And by that time, too, syrup had become a major support for small farms, and all farms, really. A lot of people were tapping and selling syrup, and there were all kinds of people who developed really complex personal urban markets. Like there's a guy whose wife wrote a memoir down in near Jamaica, whose husband tapped and they made syrup, and then he got in his jalopy, his truck, and he drove it down to Boston and sold it on the street corners. And she said, and his real Vermont twang was a super good selling point. So everybody else didn't go because they don't sound Vermonty enough. They had to send him. So syrup made possible the survival of a lot of places in the Depression and on into the mid-20th century. Then when there's that big boom for milk in the 50s, a lot of the bigger places got out of that sideline. Does that answer what you're looking for? Okay.
I have a question about the bulk milk tanks.
What?
Bulk milk tanks.
Oh, bulk milk tanks, yes.
So my dad had been basically a subsistence farmer. Then he switched over to having the Holsteins and the milk, which he sold. Then the bulk milk came in, and he basically went out of business because he couldn't So what impact did the bulk milk have in Vermont?
So the bulk milk tank did exactly what you described. The question is about the bulk milk tank that becomes a requirement in the mid-20th century for your milk to be picked up from the milk wholesalers. So you've seen the pictures of the people with their metal milk cans was the way that people used to deliver milk to market. The bulk milk tank sat in your barn and you put all your milk into it fresh right then, and it's refrigerated and it held it, and that meant that you had to have enough milk to fill them, and there are hundreds of gallons. And then the big milk trucks would drive up to you if you had a good enough driveway or road. They would drive up and take it from your bulk trunk. Problem is, they were stainless steel, gigantic hunks of stuff that cost as much often as people's whole disposable incomes in a year, or as much as, far more than the most expensive fancy equipment that they had. And so it became notorious in the late 20th century as the turning point beyond which you started to see a rapid decline in the numbers of farms. I think that's a fair way to say it. And I have met many people who said this about their parents' farms or their grandparents' farms, that they farmed until they just couldn't do it anymore. They just couldn't keep up with it. There was no support. The infrastructure demands were so high. And the bulk tank is kind of a symbol of that. It was the thing, but it was also a symbol of the entire shift of the market around you that you couldn't work with anymore. Yeah.
I just had a comment. When you were talking about the 1930s in Jamaica, Vermont, I kept thinking about Helen and Scott Nearing. And I read their first book when I was in college, and I was convinced, and I was already leaning in that direction. I was in Arizona. But, they left New York City, early 30s, I believe, came to Vermont, self-sufficiency. And that sort of became a culture among a lot of people my age.
Yeah.
And I had been here when I was 12 with a friend to their camp. And I remember at that time, deciding I was going to live in Vermont.
Yeah. And I'm going to say our generation.
They were in Jamaica, though, right?
Yes, they were, absolutely. You were absolutely right. And it's really amazing working in Jamaica, because my sources were totally separate from that, and they didn't overlap. But when you overlap the sources that I worked with their written materials, it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen. There's a whole passage in Living the Good Life where they describe the natives in Jamaica. And it's not exactly insulting. Maybe a little patronizing, but they said it's not really enough to describe Jamaicans as self-sufficient. Sovereign is the word you want. And they talked about they couldn't get anybody to work for them that they liked because people didn't have enough of a work ethic.
Well, just to go along with that, that was their first book, 5
Yeah.
Acres and Independence. And when we drove here from Arizona, it was to buy 5 acres and be independent,
Yeah.
even though I had a profession I wanted to follow. But anyway, probably 30 years ago, maybe, Helen Nearing had a book signing in Bristol. I was thrilled. I had the original, the first edition, 35 cents, printed in Canada, 5 Acres and Independence, and I brought it to have her sign it. And I mean, I idolized them. She looked up at me and she said, "I hope you're going to buy my new book." And I was crushed.
Oh.
I couldn't believe it. And I left just...
Word had it, she was
I don't want to go meet authors anymore.
Don't do it.
Because that happened with somebody else too. I forget who down here.
Word had it she was a pretty crusty old lady.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to read what they write about Jamaicans. In the context of the criticisms coming from the state government about small farmers is that they didn't work hard enough, they didn't have enough of a work ethic. They were just sitting around out there, you know, in the winter, in the woods, cutting wood, and, you know, just a little haying by hand now and then, and, you know, the dawn to dusk work of the et cetera, et cetera. It's like, yeah, how do you think they got by if they didn't work hard? But that's another matter.
Are there any numbers being collected on the amount of old farms that have been sort of regenerated by young people mainly growing crops versus animals?
You know, I don't know. I would be surprised if there weren't numbers being gathered, but they may not make the, I don't know if it's in anybody's interest to count how many of the young folks today farming are farming on old farm properties, or rather somebody's back, you know, acreage. I mean, just anecdotally, you can see there are numbers of people who are living on hill farms, especially on what were once hill farms, mostly wooded now. But I don't know. I haven't seen any statistics like that. You know, the way things are now, people probably do have numbers about it somewhere.
Forgive me for carrying on. Where I'm from, and also here in Vermont, I see a lot of Amish moving in to use the land that hasn't been used for years.
Yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah. And it's upstate New York especially. And now, talk about good land, that's really good land. I don't know about around here, but yeah. It is an interesting thing, because that, again, is a question of like making your choice about how to use your resources and fitting yourself into a niche that seems like the appropriate one to you, and not being led by markets themselves. You know.
Do you think the CSAs of these small farms has made a difference?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, CSAs. In the wake of the nearings and in the wake of the incoming population that came like that, yeah, there you go. People my age who came up then, there was a massive regeneration of local agricultural networks with cooperatives, grocery stores, you know, and with the reuse of beginning of CSAs, and with all kinds of, and the founding of NOFA, Northeast Organic Farmers Association. All those things, if you look at the numbers, they're all clustered between 1975 and 1979. You know, and that's exactly when those people who came back who came up had a desire to make a difference and a desire to make things work here, and ideas about how that would work, some of which were workable and some which didn't in the end. But in terms of food production, I think that what they did do was they created marketing possibilities and networks that made it possible for small growers to start to market what at first were very tiny products of organic farming, right? And to make there be a demand for it. Sometimes I used to tell my students, the thing you don't understand about the late 20th century, about the 1970s, is if a person wanted to eat yogurt, they had to make yogurt. There wasn't any yogurt being sold, and there wasn't any, all of that stuff. I just think yogurt is a good example. But so in terms of value-added products, I think, and in terms of like packaging and marketing of products like CSAs, it made an enormous difference in determining. I mean, I think it's responsible for Vermont's reputation now as a progressive state. Bernie notwithstanding. Good? Are we done?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.